think, okay, if I were to point to one facet of this, because one of the things from our books is we talked to hundreds of autistic people for each book to come up with the principles and answers and ideas that we come up with in them. And one of them is we have basic principles for advocacy. And the number one principle, which sounds really simple, but isn't always lived, is acceptance. So we accept that all of our needs are valid. We understand that some of our needs are conflicting.
Yeah.
Like if I had my
Yeah.
way, I would be alone 23 hours a day. And I'm in a 900 square foot house with 6 people. None of them is an introvert. One of them is very sensory sensitive like me, but they're all extroverts. They're all loud. They're all loving, good people. But, like, how do we meet these different needs? Of course, my needs tend to be the last ones that get met, but
Right.
acceptance is the number one thing. And it looks like that. It looks like, okay, we need different solutions.
So you've made the identity shift. You've made that
Yeah.
moving from rather not having that pathology lens
Oh,
of
yeah.
what's wrong with my child, what's wrong with you,
It's a
to the
huge, yeah,
neurodiversity lens of how are all these different people processing the world?
huge, huge, huge part of my work. I have written many, many blog posts about this, written about it a lot in my books. I've given speeches on it, like the pathologization, like moving away from medicalization and pathologization and diseasification of neurodiversity toward a neurotype. Um, Actually, my most recent blog post, which is like my second most read blog post ever, is I rewrote the DSM-5 definition, a diagnosis criteria for autism. And I rewrote it with language that includes the aspects of autism that it was pointing to, but uses language that's completely inclusive and affirming. And it can still be used for diagnosis, but it takes words that are like disorder and uses a different word like difference, or uses obsession and changes it to focus, like things like that.
That's awesome. And I want you to share, since we're talking about it, about both your actually autistic guides and where listeners can find more information about the documents that you're speaking about right now.
Sure. Okay, so I have a blog. That was where this sort of all originally came from, where I found my co-author and all of that. It's called Full Spectrum Mama. It's fullspectrummama.blogspot.com. And that really explores a lot of different aspects of raising extraordinary children. So it is largely about neurodivergence, particularly autism and sensory processing differences. I was in a what's called a blog hop about sensory processing differences for a really long time. So I would write monthly or weekly posts about sensory processing, but it's also about autism, but it's also talks about adoption. It talks about attachment disorders. I went through that very seriously with my daughter, who was adopted from China. And then I also am revisiting that with my grandchildren because their mother isn't much in their life. So that's the blog. And then I have a neuroscience leadership book out called Five Brain Leadership that you can just Google it and you can get it on Amazon or the publisher. Mm-hmm.
And is that one more for younger children or
So the
older?
five brain leadership is just kind of like a holistic vision of the way you can use all the different
Okay,
parts of your brain in your work and in your life. But the two actually
fabulous.
autistic guides that I have out right now, and we're working on a third one. But the first one is called the actually autistic guide to advocacy, and that's the one that I would recommend for grandparents raising younger grandchildren, people in general who it works for self advocates as well. I mean, I myself am autistic, so I'm not going to write something that's like not affirming. It's very welcoming. It talks a lot about the principles of actually autistic, like affirming advocacy. Main principles being, like I said, acceptance. Looking at the way we use language, super, super important to use language in affirming ways. Understanding that everybody makes mistakes. Another piece of that advocacy principles thing is is understanding that neurodiversity expresses itself in a lot of different ways, right? Like we have this image that who's autistic is like Rain Man, or it's like young male people who repeat things, or savants. And there are so many different ways that autism is
Forms of
expressed and that
autism.
neurodivergence is expressed, and so many different overlaps. And people sometimes assume that people who are autistic are cognitively disabled, that can happen, but it's not related with autism at all. So there's a lot of different clarification in there about
Yeah.
different ways that we can advocate that are healthy and affirming and welcoming and inclusive